America owes $38.4 trillion. That number flashes across screens, scrolls along the bottom of cable news, and fuels endless political shouting matches. But here's the uncomfortable question almost nobody asks. Who exactly is America paying? Not who we're told to fear, not the headline villains. The real creditors are far closer, far quieter, and far more powerful than most people realize. And once you see them clearly, the debt stops looking like a number and starts looking like a system that can't escape itself. Welcome to Cash Historian, and today we're pulling back the curtain on America's $38.4 trillion debt to expose the hidden creditors shaping policy, power, and the future of everyday Americans and Canadians, whether they know it or not. At first glance, the story seems simple. The United States borrows too much. Politicians overspend. Someone eventually has to pay. But that explanation is comforting in its simplicity and dangerously incomplete. Because debt doesn't just pile up randomly. It flows. It changes hands. It evolves. And over the last century, America's debt has quietly transformed from a temporary wartime tool into a permanent structure that now owns the system that created it. To understand how that happened, we have to rewind, not decades, but generations, to a time when debt still scared politicians, and paying it down was considered a moral obligation, not an inconvenience. In the early days of the Republic, debt was treated like a necessary evil. Wars were fought, bonds were issued, and then, crucially, those debts were paid off. Andrew Jackson famously eliminated the national debt in the 1830s, an idea that feels almost unthinkable today. Back then, debt was something you cleaned up after a crisis. It wasn't a permanent fixture of government. That mindset began to shift in the early 20th century. The modern world demanded modern finance, and modern finance demanded flexibility. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created, promising stability, elasticity, and protection against financial panics. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it changed the nature of debt forever. For the first time, the U.S. government had a centralized mechanism capable of expanding credit on demand. Debt could now grow smoothly, quietly, and continuously, without the political pain of immediate taxation. World War I tested this new system. It worked. The government borrowed heavily, financed the war, and survived. World War II didn't just test the system, it perfected it. By 1945, the United States emerged as the world's dominant economic power, with the dollar at the center of global trade. The Bretton Woods system tied currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, and America became the anchor of global finance. But even then, a subtle dependency was forming. The rest of the world needed dollars, and the easiest way to get dollars was through trade surpluses, selling goods to Americans and reinvesting those dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds. It was efficient, it felt stable, and it planted the seeds of a future problem that wouldn't fully bloom for decades. Fast forward to 1971. When President Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar officially severed its last physical anchor. From that moment on, U.S. debt was backed not by metal, but by trust. Trust in American institutions, American productivity, and American political stability. This wasn't presented as a revolution. It was framed as temporary, technical, necessary. But it fundamentally changed the math. Without gold-limiting issuance, U.S. treasuries could expand almost without constraint. Spending increased, deficits became routine. And foreign governments, especially Japan, later China, recycled their dollar surpluses into U.S. debt at massive scale. By the early 2000s, a simple story dominated public consciousness. America owes China. China owns America. That fear sold headlines, but it missed what was quietly happening beneath the surface. Foreign ownership of U.S. debt eventually peaked. Then it plateaued. Then it began to decline. Not because America became fiscally responsible, but because a new buyer stepped in. A buyer with unlimited capacity. A buyer that didn't need foreign exchange reserves or trade surpluses. A buyer that could create money with a keystroke. The Federal Reserve. After the 2008 financial crisis, everything accelerated. To prevent total collapse, the Fed launched quantitative easing, buying trillions of dollars in U.S. treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. This wasn't framed as debt monetization. It was described as liquidity support, temporary intervention, emergency medicine. But emergencies have a way of becoming permanent. Each crisis justified the next round. Each round made the system more dependent on low rates and high liquidity. By the mid-2020s, the Federal Reserve held a staggering share of U.S. government debt directly or indirectly. At the same time, another category of creditor exploded quietly, one that rarely makes headlines because it sounds boring and safe: intragovernmental debt. This is where things get uncomfortable. Programs like Social Security and Medicare collect payroll taxes from workers with the promise of future benefits. That money isn't saved in a lockbox. It's loaned to the Treasury in exchange for special issue bonds. In other words, the government borrows from its own trust funds to fund current operations. On paper, those trust funds hold trillions in assets. In reality, they hold promises that future taxpayers will make good on those IOUs. So when you hear that Social Security is running out, what that really means is the system is reaching the point where incoming taxes won't cover outgoing benefits, and the Treasury will need to find cash elsewhere to honor those internal debts. Raise taxes, borrow more. Inflate or delay. There is no painless option. By late 2025, America's $38.4 trillion debt is roughly divided among 5 major creditor groups: U.S. government trust funds, the Federal Reserve, domestic financial institutions like banks and pension funds, foreign governments and investors, and households through mutual funds and savings vehicles. The shocking part isn't the size, it's the shift in power. Foreign creditors, once feared as leverage-holding adversaries, now own a smaller share than they did a decade ago. The fastest-growing creditors are domestic and institutional. The system owes itself. That sounds safer, doesn't it? No foreign blackmail, no sudden geopolitical dump of treasuries. But safety is an illusion here. When a system owes itself money, the burden doesn't disappear. It just gets redistributed, usually downward. To see where this leads, look north. Canada offers a compressed version of America's future. After 2020, Canadian federal debt surged past 1.4 trillion Canadian dollars. The Bank of Canada dramatically expanded its balance sheet, buying government bonds to stabilize markets and fund emergency spending. Interest rates stayed low, asset prices exploded. Housing in Toronto and Vancouver detached completely from incomes. Young Canadians didn't just struggle to buy homes, they stopped believing they ever would. The same story is playing out across American cities, from Austin to Phoenix to Miami. Cheap credit-inflated assets, inflation-punished savers, and governments quietly became addicted to borrowing at rates that can never return to historical norms without breaking something important. Here's the brutal math. In 2025, the U.S. government spends more on interest than on national defense. Every sustained 1% increase in average interest rates adds hundreds of billions of dollars annually to debt service costs. That's money that doesn't build bridges, fund schools, or shore up Social Security. It flows directly to creditors, many of them institutions whose balance sheets now depend on government solvency. This is where the conspiracy feels less dramatic and more mechanical. There is no secret meeting where elites decide to trap the public. The trap emerges naturally from incentives. Politicians prefer short-term relief over long-term pain. Central banks prefer stability today over instability tomorrow. Markets reward leverage during booms and socialize losses during busts. Each decision makes sense in isolation. Together, they build a system that cannot stop borrowing without collapsing. Every proposed solution runs into the same wall. Raising taxes slows growth and sparks backlash. Cutting spending threatens entitlements and triggers recessions. Inflating the debt away erodes purchasing power and public trust. Default is unthinkable. So the only politically viable option is delay, rolling debt forward, refinancing old promises with new ones, hoping growth outpaces interest just long enough to avoid crisis. And here's the quiet truth. The hidden creditors benefit from delay. Pension funds need stable government bonds. Banks need treasuries as collateral. Central banks need sovereign debt markets to conduct monetary policy. The debt becomes the foundation, not the problem. Removing it would collapse the structure built on top. That's why debt ceiling fights are theater. Show footage of Congress arguing. Everyone pretends catastrophe is looming, then raises the limit at the last minute. Not because they're reckless, but because they're trapped. The system can't stop, which brings us to now. Inflation may fluctuate, rates may rise or fall, but the underlying dependency remains. In both the US and Canada, younger generations inherit not just higher prices, but fewer options. Assets are expensive, wages lag. Taxes face upward pressure, and the largest creditor to their future labor isn't a foreign government. It's the financial architecture they were born into. So let's crystallize what matters before we end. First takeaway. America's debt is no longer primarily foreign-owned. It's system-owned. That makes it less vulnerable to external shocks, but far harder to unwind without internal pain. Second takeaway. Central banks are now both the stabilizers and the enablers of permanent debt. Their tools prevent collapse, but deepen long-term dependence on borrowing and low rates. Third takeaway. Debt doesn't end in explosion, it ends in erosion. Purchasing power, social mobility, and trust decline gradually, quietly, and unevenly. So here's the question to leave you with. If the biggest creditor to the U.S. government is ultimately the system itself, trust funds, central banks, and institutions, who really pays when confidence finally cracks? And how do you prepare for a future where debt is no longer a temporary problem, but a permanent condition? This is Cash Historian. If this video helped you see the debt not as a number, but as a structure shaping your future, hit like, subscribe to Cash Historian for more deep dives like this, and share it with someone who still thinks the debt is just an abstract headline.